Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of EPP Family Talks. My name is Nathan Shapura, European People's Party political advisor, and we would love to invite you to this episode. This is the fifth installment. Over the past 2 weeks, we have been bringing our political family together by hearing from our leaders about the projects and the ideas they're working on, particularly during this coronavirus crisis. Today, it is our great pleasure to welcome Margaritis Schinas, former member of the European Parliament, former spokesperson for the European Commission, and current Vice President of the European Commission for promoting the European way of life. Vice President, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Nathan.
We're trying in this series to be a little bit impersonal in the way we talk to our different EPP leaders. So we want to hear about the different ideas, the projects you're working on, but we're starting with all of our leaders by simply asking a personal question, which is, during this time of lockdown, how are things been for you? How are you coping? What's the typical day for you been like?
Well, for me, these 5 weeks have been very atypical of a life which was full of mobility, travel, coming up and down, and of course, it's a very abrupt and very radical change of life. Still, I have decided to organize all my professional calls, video conferences from the office. We have a special license by the Belgian authorities to do so, members of the Commission. That gives me changes a bit the routine of the lockdown, but it also allows me benefit from better infrastructure and more security around my communication. So this helps me a bit change the day. But then, of course, the rest of the day is work from home and with some intervals that I want to ensure every day in my planning that have to do with some sport, with some cooking, and lots of reading.
Well, I hope at the end of our interview we'll come back to some more informal questions, and I want to follow up on maybe some of the things you're reading. But another question just before we get to your actual portfolio, and that's about your own home country of Greece, which is being led now by our EPP friend, Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and our EPP member party, Neo Demokratia. What is the situation like now in Greece?
Well, I am delighted that Greece, in a way, has emerged as a paradigm of crisis management during the pandemics. Um, this is an amazing success story, widely recognized internationally, I would say. It's very difficult for a people that comes out of a 10-year financial crisis that went through a very acute migration crisis. Now this is the third big, if you like, difficulty that the Greeks face. But they have been remarkable, first in dealing with the situation, second in having this sort of collective discipline for which, as you know, we Greeks are not very well known. And then for having a government, as you rightly point out, under Kyriakos Mitsotakis, which is a government that focuses on the essential with a very clear managerial side of politics. They are not lost in details. They do not do political politics at this moment. They have given lots of room to the experts, to the people who know. And I think overall, the numbers in Greece, I think, are among the lowest in the European Union. And that's great news.
Well, maybe I can transition now to asking you about your portfolio more broadly, and maybe even more generally, first of all, than the crisis itself. Your portfolio is promoting the European way of life. This is, as far as I know, the first time this has been a portfolio in the Commission. Could you, maybe for people who don't know, just explain what this means exactly, and how is the European way of what is the European way of life, and how should it be promoted?
Well, I had the occasion to present in more detail how I see the European way of life in my hearings to the European Parliament in October, November last year. For me, the European way of life is democracy, rule of law, the protection of minorities, safeguarding the role of women in the society, in the family, in the workplace. It's about being the world champion of human rights, data protection. It's about having universal systems of health and education that are inclusive, that protect the most vulnerable. It's about taking care of our elderly. It's about not having the death penalty. All this is the European way of life. This is what makes us unique as Europeans in the world. Now, on a more practical level of portfolio, this is vice presidency indeed is a new one. This is a job that never existed in the past. And the areas that fall under my responsibility, which is migration, security, education, culture, skills, youth, these were areas where traditionally work was organized in a sort of a silo mentality or approach, if you like. So we used to work within each work stream of those in a way that was not necessarily connected to the other. So this is the first time where we attempt to sort of cross-fertilize our work between these different strands. And the common denominator, what bundles all this together, I think is the European way of life. And that's how I see my job. That's how the president described my job in my mission letter. And that is what I'm now with the commissioners that work with me. This is where we collectively dedicate our efforts.
I want to focus on the coronavirus crisis, but maybe one question before we get to that you maybe just briefly touched on, and mentioning the different parts of your portfolio. Migration is one of them, and this is an area that maybe in the last few weeks hasn't gotten the same attention as it was getting previously. But of course, there isn't still an issue of irregular migration, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially via Turkey. Could you just tell us what's the state of play on that situation?
Well, as you probably remember, there was an attempt to instrumentalize or weaponize desperate people who were pushed to the Greek-Turkish border on the weekend of the 2nd of March. It was a blatant attempt to test Europe's determination to protect our external border. I think that the presence of all EU leaders together with Kyriakos Mitsotakis at the border showed, it was a very tangible way to show that no one can blackmail or intimidate the European Union. The collective response of the EU was very evident, supportive to the government. But and I'm happy that the situation has since normalized at the external border. But this doesn't mean that we should now relax and think that migration is not a problem anymore. On the contrary, we have promised to the European Parliament and to the European Council to come up with an EU pact for migration and asylum, which will be a new attempt after the failed attempt of 2016 to come up with a cohesive, unique, comprehensive framework for asylum and migration at the EU level that has an external dimension, working with countries of origin and transit, has a borders dimension, allows us collectively to defend our border, and has a solidarity dimension that enables us to make all member states work together so that they share the burden, not leaving a disproportionate responsibility and burden for managing migratory flows to the countries of first entry. So this idea of a pact is very much alive. It's one of the most emblematic initiatives of this commission, and I think we should be able to present it as promised.
I just want to focus now maybe on the thing that everybody has been thinking about and dealing with 24/7 in the last several weeks, and that's this coronavirus crisis. And you just mentioned with the issue of migration, the importance of solidarity. Of course, solidarity is important on all kinds of issues. Several days ago, I thought it was very interesting. You went on Spanish TV with a message of hope and solidarity, assuring citizens that the EU would not emerge from this crisis weakened. Could you elaborate a bit on what your message was, and why is this such an important message?
Yes, I think it's an important message. It's a rather obvious one. That we went through a first stage of divergence, given the nature of this crisis. In a way, this was predictable. Member states tried to organize themselves as they could. Then we went through a stage of convergence where everybody found out that we have lots to share in managing this crisis. The single market, our supply chains, our interdependence is so big that we cannot allow ourselves to work in an uncoordinated way. So we, as Commission, helped provide the glue, if you like, that helped this convergence phase. And now we are reaching the third and hopefully final stage, which is the exit, recovery, and communality stage. So in my interview, the Spanish TV, that was particularly appreciated given the scale of the problem that we had in Spain. It's a tragedy. What I said is that Europe, in a way, grows bigger out of this crisis, out of crisis in general. It is at the moment of crisis where we Europeans realize how much we need each other. And I use the term family. It's always when you are in difficulty that you seek the support of the family, and then you realize that the people you can family. So we are a European family. In these difficult moments, we feel for each other, we understand each other, and when all this will be over, then we will understand that we left it behind as a family altogether. And I'm really convinced that Europe will not come out weakened by this crisis. On the contrary.
On that theme of family, the EPP family is a very strong family and the leading family in the European political scene. And one of the things you've been very involved with recently is participating actively in EPP foreign and European ministers meetings via video conference, like all of these other meetings taking place now. What are you hearing most from these foreign and European ministers and our EPP family, and how do you see the EPP playing a role in solidarity and in this recovery?
Well, first of all, I appreciated the invitation both by the political family, our group president Donald Tusk and Secretary General Tono Lopez Isturiz, but also from the Croatian presidency to have me in these meetings of foreign ministers and Europe ministers. These were very useful, both in terms of providing information from Brussels, but also of receiving feedback from our frontline politicians. I think what I found out in these calls is that ministers for Europe and ministers for foreign affairs, of course, they have a specific interest in areas like global preparedness, like repatriations, consular support, borders. But it was also an opportunity for us to explain to them that the Commission works on many different other levels during this crisis, procurement, state aids, economic recovery, tourism. So it was a very useful and a very political, if you like, moment where I learned a lot from them, but I also had the opportunity to explain big chunks of our work that was not always evident to this part of the government functioning.
I might just have one or two final serious questions for you, and they deal with, or I guess I would go back to a very eloquent blog you wrote. I think you've been a regular blogger during this coronavirus crisis, but your most recent one, I think, was a few days ago, and in it you basically talk about the roadmap for recovery. The Council and Commission published recently a roadmap for recovery, and the first thing I would ask you is just what are the key elements of this, and what is the next phase? What are the next steps?
Yes, indeed. Last week we presented a European roadmap for exit, and we will be in the next 10 days coming up with a global recovery plan. On the exit, on the roadmap for exit, we were very clear that this is not a top-down Brussels centralized plan that would decide when we will exit collectively in Europe from the confinement constraints. This is not the idea. Our roadmap was meant to be a set of criteria, objective criteria, science-based, that would allow our governments to craft their national exit strategies on the basis of these criteria. And I think these were universally liked, these criteria and the roadmap, and will be discussed in a few hours in the European Council, which is taking place today. Now, on the recovery, there things are different because the recovery plan, kickstarting the economy again, would be a huge challenge. One should not forget the things that we have already done so far, unprecedented things. The 750 billion asset purchase program by the BCE, which is not just showing a bazooka, but it's actually firing a bazooka. It's the 100 billion euros of the SURE program proposed by the Commission for curing unemployment. It's the total flexibility in the structural funds that put fresh money and new money on the table. It has to do with the complete relaxation of the Stability and Growth Pact rules that gives flexibility to member states. Same goes for state aid, public procurement. So there is a whole lot of work that has already been done on recovery. The 500 million euros agreed by the Eurogroup through the ESM. But there is one piece missing of this puzzle, probably the last one and the most important one, which is how we will make sure to raise a lot of money without burdening our member states disproportionately. In a way, all member states face a symmetrical threat. We have, through this recovery plan, to find a way to have a symmetrical way out. It would be unfair for some to suffer disproportionately from others. So this essential premise of the recovery plan, which will be again discussed for the first time this afternoon by our leaders, will be crystallized by a Commission proposal in the next 10 days. And it will be based on a new proposal around the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework, which will allow the recovery plan to be anchored into the community budget and into our common rules, into the community method, to allow for this symmetrical response. So this is the last bit missing, but it is about to be presented.
I have one more serious question for you, and I would just say one of the things I appreciate personally about your leadership is your appreciation for narrative and story and your use of metaphor. And one of the very interesting, colorful metaphors which you used in this most recent blog post in which you were writing about the roadmap for recovery was this contrast between Achilles' heel and Achilles' shield. Of course, Achilles was the great Homeric hero. Achilles' heel was his weak spot, and that's the coronavirus itself and the pandemic. But you also talked about the Achilles' shield as being, my understanding, sort of a metaphor for the European way of life and for all the values and all the benefits, the good which it confers. Could you maybe just elaborate a bit on that and why you thought of that particular metaphor?
First of all, I'm very honored that you read my article, my op-ed, and I'm particularly happy that you understood the metaphor. I was not sure that everybody would, because indeed, well, both my parents are professors of classical literature. So when I was a boy, I was raised up with Homer, Iliad, and the Odyssey. So these notions, ideas are very, very present in me, in my education. Indeed, the Achilles heel analogy for Europe is fragmentation and lack of solidarity. That's what makes us vulnerable. And the Achilles shield, which was a masterpiece, according to Homer, crafted for Achilles by Hephaestus, the god of the technician god, if you like, symbolizes added value of unity, solidarity, the new beginning. And oddly enough, in the Iliad, Achilles' shield is not decorated with scenes of war, but it's decorated by scenes of joy, uh, weddings, uh, popular festivities, which is an additional symbol of this new beginning. So in this op-ed, I said, okay, we know which is our Achilles' heel, fragmentation, lack of solidarity. Now is the moment to use the Achilles shield. And I'm convinced that this will be the case, by the way, because everything converges to the need for solidarity, coordination, and common action.
Thank you for that perspective. For those people who may not know, Hephaestus by his Greek name, his Latin equivalent is Vulcan, of course. Well, that concludes the more policy-oriented, serious sort of part of this interview. And if you still had a couple of minutes, I would ask you a couple of more informal or personal questions, which hopefully can help people get to know you a little bit better as well. And my first one would be just on the subject of Homer. Do you have a favorite Homeric character or a favorite Homeric theme, and why would that be?
Well, although I used Achilles in this op-ed, I'm not an Achilles type myself. I would personally prefer Ulysses. He was more. Sorry.
Or Odysseus, no?
Odysseus, yes, Odysseus, Ulysses. He was a more, how should I put it, a less mercurial figure than Achilles. He was always very focused on solutions, practical, smart, always finding a practical way out of the problem, making sure that everybody worked together. And most importantly, I share with Ulysses this attachment to one's roots, because Ulysses, after fighting 10 years in Troy and suffering a lot on his way back, never forgot that his ultimate goal was Ithaca. So this attachment to where we all come from, I think, despite, in my case, leading a very European and mobile life, I do share much more with Odysseus than with Achilles.
One final question for you, and it's not unrelated to things you were saying at the very beginning of this interview in terms of how you're spending your time and your days. Is there anything interesting that you've recently watched or read which you could recommend to people?
Yes, I watched something that I had missed at the time, which is a documentary on Maradona's life, which I found very, very interesting. It was made from Asif Karajan, and it shows all the lights and shadows in the life of such a gifted football player. And I'm still reading with lots of interest, the biography of Richard Holbrooke by George Cooper, which provides a fantastic insight in the life of a great internationalist, but also an American who, in a way, was the last one of a certain age of America where the Americans were heavily involved in international affairs, where they contributed a lot in settling international crises in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, and it is an excellent read. And I'm very happy that one of the few good things of the confinement is that I can read a book calmly, not in a rush between planes or reading papers.
Vice President, thank you so much. On behalf of the EPP, thank you for your time, for the practical solutions a la Odysseus that you're putting on the table. Thank you for the important work you're doing. And we hope to see you again soon and wish you and your family all the best during this time. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us for this episode of EPP Family Talks. And please join us again next time when we speak tomorrow at 2 o'clock with YEP President and Member of the European Parliament, Lydia Pereira. Thank you so much and have a good day.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you.